There is this persistent myth in American politics that just won't die, and it's that the Democratic Party is somehow the party of civil rights, which is why I've entitled the playlist this video is in Stolen Valor, A History of the Democratic Party, because it simply is factually untrue. And we're going to look at the history of the Democrats today with a piece of living history, which is Creepy Joe Biden. You can see him here sniffing a young woman's hair. And here he is touching and sniffing on another woman, although it doesn't seem to bother her so much. And here he is kissing a little boy on the mouth. And here he is with his hands around a teenage girl and eyeing a little baby quite hungrily. So, as a reminder, because this just seems to slip our collective memory, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the original House version had 61% Democrat support and 80% Republican Party support. When the Senate version was voted on by the House, it had 63% Democrat support and again 80% Republican Party support. And the Senate version had 69% Democrat support and 82% Republican support. So you're seeing 80% plus support for civil rights by Republicans, in the 60% range by the Democrats, but somehow Republicans are remembered as the party of racists. So we're going to dive into that a little more. When the Civil Rights Act was being passed, another Democrat, Robert Byrd, on June 10th, 1964, Senator Robert Byrd, Democrat, West Virginia, completed a filibustering address that he had begun 14 hours and 13 minutes earlier opposing the legislation. He died in office on June 28, 2010. So here's a Democrat that was in office until 2010. Robert Byrd was a recruiter for the KKK while in his 20s and 30s, rising to the title of Kleagle and Exalted Cyclops of his local chapter, and he was a mentor of the late great Hillary Clinton, who ran for office in 2016. So this idea that the Democrats suddenly became pro-civil rights in the 60s is quite the myth here. Another prominent Democrat of the era was George C. Wallace, who took the oath of office in 1963, standing on the gold star where 102 years earlier, President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy was sworn in as provisional president of the Confederate States of America, okay? In his inaugural speech, Wallace said, "In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." George Wallace was in office as a Democrat until 1987. You can see him here. His most famous moment was the stand in the schoolhouse door where he blocked black children from integrating. And it was so bad they actually had to send in the National Guard. So these were Biden's contemporaries here. And in this article, it's titled, Joe Biden, Letters Reveal How He Sought Support of Segregationists in Fight Against Busing. So let's look into this. There's Creepy Joe as a younger man. Joe Biden's road to a third presidential bid has been lined with a series of explanations and apologies, illustrating the challenges of preparing a long record of public service for fresh scrutiny under the spotlight of the 2020 campaign. It always amazes me how soft they can tone down their rhetoric when it's somebody that they want to win. It's just illustrating the challenges. Imagine if Trump had done anything like this in his life. Yet he rarely discusses one of his earliest and most controversial issues he championed in the Senate, his fight against busing to desegregate schools. In a series of never-before-published letters from Biden, I wonder why they weren't published during 2008. Why didn't they come out then? Was there some sort of suppression going on? Which were reviewed by CNN. The strength of his opposition to busing comes into sharper focus, particularly how he followed the lead and sought support from some of the Senate's most fervent segregationists. And this is actually a euphemism for the people he sought support from. Biden, who at the time was 34, so maybe he was just young and impressionable. Is that the excuse being made? Biden, who at the time was 34 and serving in his first term, oh yeah, that's definitely it, in the Senate, repeatedly asked for and received the support of Senator James Eastland, a Mississippi Democrat, and chairman of the Judiciary Committee and a leading symbol of Southern resistance, oh there's that word again, resistance, to desegregation. Eastland frequently spoke of blacks as an inferior race, so Joe Biden sought this guy out. And he wrote to him, "Dear Mr. Chairman." Biden wrote on June 30th, 1977, mind you, not in the 60s when the Democrats supposedly became the party of civil rights, almost 1980. "Dear Mr. Chairman, I want you to know that I very much appreciate your help during this week's committee meeting in attempting to bring my anti-busing legislation to a vote." 2 weeks later, Biden followed up with a note to Eastland to thank you again for your efforts in support of my bill to limit court-ordered busing. So who is James Eastland? That's this happy-looking gentleman here. And right out of his Wikipedia, James Eastland was an American white supremacist politician from Mississippi who served in the United States Senate as a Democrat in 1941 and again from 43 until his resignation in December 27, 1978. Again, almost until the 80s. You have George Wallace until the late 80s and Robert Byrd until 2010 and Hillary Clinton in 2016. Anyway, Eastland is known for having opposed integration in the American civil rights movement, which increasingly became active in the mid-20th century, which most Democrats were opposed to civil rights. During World War II, Eastland vocally opposed and degraded the service of African American soldiers in the war. He incited protest and comparisons to Hitlerism following a vitriolic speech on the floor of the Senate in July 1945, in which he complained that the Negro soldier was physically, morally, and mentally incapable of serving in combat. Quite the change of perspective from what it was in Vietnam. In contrast, Eastland claimed that the boys from the South were fighting to maintain white supremacy. There was also an event where 3 civil rights workers, Mickey Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, went missing in Mississippi on June 21, 1964, during the Freedom Summer efforts to register African American voters. Eastland tried to convince President Lyndon Johnson that the incident was a hoax and there was no KKK in the state. He suggested that the 3 had gone to Chicago, so deny, deny, deny. We see this today. Same tactic. So those 3, they were field social workers that it was eventually revealed were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi by the KKK. So in a recorded conversation between President Johnson and Eastland, Johnson says, "Jim, we've got 3 kids missing down there. What can I do about it? And Eastland says, well, I don't know. I don't believe there's 3 missing. Johnson says, we've got their parents down here. And Eastland's response is, I believe it's a publicity stunt. This is Joe Biden working with this guy, regularly seeking his help. I mean, Wikipedia. Yeah. Anyway. So, the article continues. Biden, who would go on to lead the Judiciary Committee a decade later, got his start on the panel under Eastland. James Eastland here. Few senators were more brilliantly outspoken against desegregation than the Mississippi senator, who was known for incendiary floor speeches on race. Yet, Biden invited Eastland to speak on the Senate floor in support of his anti-busing bill. And then he said to him again, I want to personally ask your continued support and alert you to our intentions. Biden wrote on August 22nd, 1978, your participation in the floor debate would be welcomed. Again, this is Democrats opposing civil rights as late as almost the 80s here. While most of Biden's legislative efforts failed, he was not a passive observer like many fellow Democrats of the era, which I just highlighted this because I find it hilarious. A passive observer. This is how they are relinquishing guilt from the rest of the Democrats. Almost 40% of them oppose the Civil Rights Act. Is that just being a passive observer? Was George C. Wallace blocking the schoolhouse door a passive observer? Was Robert Byrd recruiting for the KKK a passive observer? Most of the Democrats, they're just standing by, not doing anything. Well, 80% of Republicans were fighting for civil rights. How history got twisted is beyond me. So, we continue here. When an anti-integration amendment from North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms failed, Biden proposed an anti-busing amendment of his own that rankled Senator Ed Brooke, a Massachusetts Republican, and the first black senator to be elected since Reconstruction. So here we have Edward Brooke, first black senator since Reconstruction. There's this picture there. Biden was fighting this guy in the Senate. So Biden continued, I have become convinced that busing is a bankrupt concept. So here are some of the excuses. We all evolve and grow. Okay. Ask yourself if a Republican would get such treatment. Anyway, we all evolve and grow, but we're still going to have to answer for our past records, Dunn told CNN. Well, Dunn said Biden's views should be considered through the full context of nearly half a century in public life. He said he doubts Barack Obama could have reached the White House if anti-busing legislation, like Biden's, would have succeeded. So, you can take that as you will. I don't know if that's true or not true, but this individual at least suggests had Biden's legislative agenda been successful, there never would have been a Barack Obama. And the last controversial issue here is reparations. They say Biden has yet to offer his view of reparations. And yet, just a little ways further down in the article, Biden has offered his view of reparations. In a 1975 interview, Biden conducted with a Delaware newspaper, which at the time was entered into the congressional record, Biden said, quote, I don't feel responsible for the sins of my father and grandfather, Biden said in the interview. I feel responsible for what the situation is today, for the sins of my own generation, and I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago. That sounds like a pretty concrete position on reparations. And again, I just kind of chuckle because imagine if a Republican said this. I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago. And in true form, rewriting history, Biden has repeatedly touted his progressive roots. Well, we've seen Biden's roots, declaring last month to a Delaware audience, I have the most progressive record of anybody running. And last week he said, I was never labeled as a moderate. Well, that seems to be at the very least true. So everybody asks me what kind of Democrat I am, Biden said. I am an Obama-Biden Democrat man, and I'm proud of it. So I kind of wonder, how is this going to play out in the press, in the national discussion? And I do think when you look at what's going on here, these are kind of progressive warning shots across the bow. He's the presumptive front runner. He's very likely going to be the Democratic nominee, at least at this point in time, it appears that way. And I think what the left is telling Joe is, we own you. These sorts of articles are going to continue. They're going to softball it. They're going to make the excuses. They're going to offer nuance. They're going to cover up the ties to the KKK and George Wallace and these other Democrats, that Robert Byrd, that actively have overt racist histories. They're going to kind of sweep this all under the rug, and they're not going to talk about it unless, and this is the big thing, unless he doesn't go to a war that CNN wants, unless he doesn't favor a policy that the left wants, unless he can't go it alone, because say Biden is the nominee and say he beats Trump in 2020. This is an owned candidate. This is a candidate the media knows because they know how to incite racial violence. They know how to get riots going. All they got to do is jingle these skeletons in the closet and say, by the way, if you step out of line, we're going to destroy you.